Fictions and Fabricated Facts. Club Pizza. We had pulled into camp late, and by the time I'd levelled and stabilised the caravan and had plumbed us into power, water and silage, it was night, dark and cold. We would have cooked the lamb chops we had in the fridge, except that chops always splatter fat, and after a long hard drive, neither of us felt like setting up the outside cooker in the chill. So I was sent off to scavenge an evening meal from wherever might be open. It was one of those little beach towns, with no sales point but one general store selling fuel and everything else, well past closing time. But driving across the lagoon bridge, I saw dim lights in the Lawn Bowling Club. Such clubs scatter across the nation, populated as long as memory can recall by generations of white, sports-clad pensioners. With no interest in bowls but a focus on grub, I turned into the deserted car park in hope of hunting down some ready food for my waiting woman at home. It was clear through the glass doors that the place was closed, but before I turned back to the car, the vision appeared of a t-shirted bloke creaking one door open, asking what I was after. With the pudgy pallor and thinning swept-back hair of a publican, he considered my question on where food might be found. He gave discouraging news. "Nah, the closest is about 25 kilometres up north." He added, "With the roos at this time of night, you wouldn't want to go more than 60 k's, alluding to the propensity of Australian wildlife to hop before speeding headlights so they can be stunned by the bright and run into. "Might not be worth it," was his balanced conclusion, and mine as well. I thanked him, but before moving away he asked, "Do you eat pizza?" "Sure," I replied. "We eat most anything." "I've got some in the fridge, and could put one on if you like." That was a plan I could get behind, so I expressed gratitude for his trouble and concern I'd be holding him back. Brushing off my weak objection, "No worries, I've got stuff to do anyway, and could use the company." He disappeared somewhere to start the pizza off and returned for a yarn. He told me how he was the manager and how he had run a large sports club somewhere in South Australia before coming back home to be close to his mum and getting work here. He asked about our travels and told of his own to Japan and Nepal, but conversation then returned to the big club he'd run for years down south. He told of security problems and the occasional need for police, but said it was dead quiet round here. I had no reason to doubt anything he said till he started casual talk of the ghosts who had haunted his former employment. It had been built close to an old quarantine station where many hundreds had perished coming off ships with smallpox and other diseases. Bodies were buried in the sand high above tide, but were then exposed and swept out by a great storm. He said there'd been several ghosts. One was an old man who haunted one of the hotel rooms, eternally reserved for him alone and never rented out. Another was of a lady in a red dress who kept to the bar, visible only in the mirror, but turn around and you couldn't see her. The third he described as the bane of his life. It was a little ghost girl who would mischievously tip over glass racks, slam bar doors open and shut, or frighten the patrons by spinning a glass before their eyes, the girl herself unseen. I asked how he knew it was a little girl, and he explained, "There's a picture, and she's looking out of it." How that might confirm identity I couldn't know, but I wasn't about to argue the point. He mentioned an occasion when he'd had too much to drink and had decided to spend the night in one of the rooms. An elderly lady had wandered in and sat at the end of his bed, and he'd spent much of the night amicably chatting with her drunk. When he went down to breakfast with his colleagues the morning after, they told him she was the ghost of a woman who had been beheaded by her husband over 100 years before. He said, "I didn't mind, we had a great old chat." So there were 4 ghosts in total. Given his talent for seeing the departed, I asked, "Are there any ghosts about here?" He glanced at me as if to say, "Don't be silly." But his expression quickly softened as he explained, "Nah, there's nothing like that round here at all." He eventually produced the pizza in a cardboard box, so I thanked him for his trouble and conversation as he locked the door behind me and vanished to his work. Box opened back in the van, the pizza itself was burnt to an inedible crisp, so we dined on cheese and biscuits and went to bed. Now it's at this point the story bifurcates for two alternate endings. I could tell you. A day or so later, I drove past the bowling club to discover it burnt to the ground. Marked aside were the remains of a neglected remembrance with fallen over plastic flowers. Looking closer, half buried in the dust, was a laminated photo of the pallid-faced, thin-haired manager who'd succumbed to a pizza fire a year or so before. Alternatively, I could and indeed must tell you how that immediately past paragraph is complete and utter nonsense. Instead, we didn't make it back to the bowling club during our few days there, but proceeded on our unremarkable way further down the coast. The bowling club, and presumably its manager, remained to the best of my knowledge entirely unsinged, with white-dressed bowlers keeping score, chasing bowls up and down the lawn from beer to beer, as they have for unnumbered decades thus far, and hopefully also, with any luck at all, far into an indefinite future, pizza fires, floods, and separate misadventures notwithstanding. While the rest of my club pizza story is entirely factual, of the two alternative conclusions, it is only the second that is true, while the first past spooky conclusion is just a formulaic fiction intended to entertain. The manager was certainly not a ghost. He was just a guy who liked a good old chinwag and was full of ghost stories. Narrative and fact. While I find myself at pains to clarify the distinction in my little ghost story between fabrication and concrete fact, I have become ever more troubled by the swallowing up of our collective minds of narratives often and increasingly divorced from reality. We are a storytelling species such that much of our shared past seems only intelligible in the form of stories. My interest in history only emerged whilst at university. As a child, I was monomaniacally focused on science and believed the innocent foolishness that science, the study of the concrete physical world, was the only proper thing to study, with all that other humanities stuff being inherently suspect as it could not be subjected to the rigorous reality testing that scientific experiments permit. It didn't strike me as inconsistent at the time, but certainly does now, that for leisure I would read novels, which in youth I still failed to perceive as one of the great fruits of the humanities. Adding to my deeply unbalanced world perspective was that in Australian high schools at that time, students had remarkable power to select subjects of their liking, so it was possible for me to graduate from high school with a sound grasp of the fundamentals of science and mathematics, and to be almost entirely ignorant about everything else. Thank heavens there were mandatory English and music classes, else I'd have been an entirely inarticulate and complete savage. Superficially counter to my nature, I did study art in the junior years, but that was because I enjoyed drawing and saw that doing it well demanded careful observation and study of the objects being drawn, a process aligned with what science seemed all about. As a student at high school and university, I did reasonably well, giving me cause to feel my education was sound and growing in strength day by day. But as said, for entertainment, I'd read novels and found myself during my second year of dentistry reading The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien. Somewhere along the way, it occurred to me that Tolkien's books detailed a history, albeit of a fictional place. But it was interesting to see how the unfolding story explained the state of the fictional world conjured with Tolkien's pen and imagination. On further reading and reflection, it struck me further that the only way you could possibly understand the goings-on in Middle-earth was through its history, through its story, through its narrative. The next naturally unfolding thoughts rather shocked me. Given that the fictional Middle-earth could only be understood through its fictional history, it was logical that the very real 1970s Australia in which I lived could only be understood through its history. I recall putting the book down and thinking for a moment. What do I really know about how the human world works? Countries, cultures, economies. All that stuff that I've ignored and isn't science. With the exception of the minimal functional knowledge required to move about the world, I was horrified to realise that beyond the strictly limited confines of my areas of study, I knew pretty much nothing at all. The appalling truth had been made clear to me by the good Mr. Tolkien that although amongst the more accomplished of school leavers and university students, I was, in words entirely accurate, shit ignorant. That was when I first understood how terribly important it was to study well beyond the sciences to which I'd limited myself till then. My favourite second-hand bookshop was in Sydney's George Street, Gould's Book Arcade, with the bearded and ever-watchful Mr. Gould seated raised up front, always reading but occasionally glancing across the store in what must have been his never-ending war against shoplifters. The history section seemed the right place to start my new education, but was full of terribly specific tracts, and what I needed was a sensible starting point, a book to give me a broad overview of the human story. Scanning the shelves, World History was written on the yellowing cloth spine of a moderately thick, dog-eared text. The paper was of coarse wood-speckled pulp, but the black print was clear, as were the black and white maps illustrating important human distributions at important times. World History had been printed sometime in the late 1940s, but at the time I didn't think that mattered because history is history and by definition can't change. A few years later, wishing to fill the gap between the final chapters of my first history book and the end of the 1970s, I bought a more recently written text with the same title, but from a separate publisher, and was surprised to learn that history does indeed change over time. Apparently, we all become something different as we all move through time together, so the narrative must be forever reinterpreted and rewritten to speak to each generation as it comes and passes away. Who'd have thought that? Probably everyone but me. Comparing my two world history books, it seemed that the closer the author was to the events described, the more biased and coloured by the time's ethos the script would become. But as years and more books passed through my fingers, I came to value old accounts of events long gone, with the distortions and prejudices telling their own story of the authors and their times. Whether histories or myths, it is fascinating to read truly ancient words by ancient writers. How wonderful and rare a thing it is to hear thoughts written hundreds or thousands of years ago by people for whom our time and world would be unrecognisable. Ancient texts always make me feel like a privileged eavesdropper, craning to hear the whisperings and wheezings of long-dead scribes, marking words in clay tablets or scratching over walls, parchments or papyrus. It is near magic for their words to be heard still today, even when the very sounds of the words themselves may be uncertain, and the whispering scribes are gone, forgotten and dust. Time machines and broken chains. The movie The Time Machine, starring Rod Taylor, was released the same year I was born, and although I did not see it in the theatre, it made an impression on me as a boy when broadcast on television. The hero of the story has transported himself to a far distant future where humanity has divided in two, an aggressive, nasty, subterranean culture of ugly brutes, and a far more attractive, docile, bovine-minded surface culture of blonde-haired, empty-headed twits upon whom the brutes below regularly feast. Arriving at the surface, Rod Taylor asked the blank blonde locals who they are and how they came to be there. They seemed to know nothing, so he asked, "Do you have books?" Brightening slightly, one dullard answered, "Yes, we have books." "Oh, wonderful! is our time traveller's response. I can learn all about you from books. Books will tell me what I want to know. Could I see the books? He asked. He was led to a dusty, unused room where he pulled, unintended to the ground, a decaying curtain that hid a dusted bookshelf. He reached eagerly to a handy volume, and my heart fell as the paper and all the books stored crumbled at his touch. Looking at the blank-faced blonde, he said, "Yes, they do tell me all about you." The time traveller raged in disgust against the negligent decay of human thought and knowledge allowed by the dim-witted folk he discovered in the future. I shared his sentiment, and that part of the film stays vivid with me still today. Good fictions can foretell coming facts, and I'd have never imagined as a boy to find myself later struggling against the tide of thoughtless negligence portrayed in The Time Machine. While I do love our nomad life, I also miss my home library, where old books are old friends sharing old stories that I enjoy, and to which I add new books for new leisure. But the stringencies of caravan tow loads and storage have packed my library well away till such time as we cease our travels, which may or may never occur. Nonetheless, we often visit local municipal libraries on our wanderings to work quietly in the air conditioning or just read anything that looks interesting lying about. I did love the great libraries of my university. Entering the main Fisher Library entailed pushing through a constant blast of air conditioning, heavily scented with dry paper and book glue. Fisher comprised two buildings, one low but several stories high and housing most of the texts and general reference books, and the other being a tall tower stack closely packed with shelves holding mostly student research theses, research journals, and other less often used books. I was always awestruck wandering along the narrow bookshelved passages where volumes numbered back to the mid-1800s were common and could be pulled out to marvel at what they thought way back then. It was fascinating to flick through the pages and see careful deliberations on things that now seem entirely self-evident, but that in their time demanded great effort to establish. Also recorded were occasional reports of investigations that might now seem a bit silly, but that will have been quite reasonable to explore at the time. There in the library was a collected struggle to better understand the world, going back to generations now forgotten, but through whose effort the modern world was built. There were other specialist libraries across the campus, all of which had research journals from the earliest times of the university. I often made use of the Badham Library, which housed collections of fundamental biological sciences, the Anderson Stewart and Burkitt Ford libraries, focused on basic biomedical sciences, and the Medical Library, where most of the pathology journals I needed were stored. The university did have a most wonderful and fairly complete collection, and it was impossible to not feel reverence and gratitude for the summated wisdom those great spaces held. It was a privilege to be there, and a greater privilege yet to be a research student, training to add my own contributions to those learnings. But it was to the dental library that I felt most attached, not because I often used it, although I obviously did, but because it was there that my own place in the abstract struggle to create knowledge was made most physically tactile. Knowledge reaches us through an unbroken chain of thinkers and scholars back to a dark and distant past. Academics are duty-bound to forge their own links in that chain for others to further propagate into whatever future mankind may have. Amongst the journals and textbooks, the Dental Library housed student research theses written by many of my own lecturers and professors in their younger training years. Also on the shelves were some still older works written by the then already long gone and forgotten mentors to the generation of tutors who had taught me. To hold and open those rare books was to physically touch the ambition of my own research training, to take my own place, forging my own link into the future. The library gave physical presence to my role and responsibility as an academic in training, I can't imagine any serious research student wouldn't have felt the same. And yet, many years later, I found myself in a meeting of us senior academics with the Dean, during which the fate of the dental library was discussed. Some manager somewhere had decided it was too much trouble and too expensive to have libraries full of books, and that it would be best were as much as possible to be online. There was an initiative to toss out any books that hadn't been borrowed for some years and to gather those which were deemed still useful to a separate, more central library, with the dental library closed entirely. Research theses were to be scanned and digitised before being pulped. I was horrified and pointed to the fact that dental students needed a dental library close to the dental hospital where they studied and worked at dentistry. For the Dean, that seemed an unreasonable and novel concept. I also argued strongly against physical destruction of the research theses, which, as I explained at the time, comprised the intellectual history of our school. Most digital scans at that time were of very poor quality, and I stressed how important it was for research images taken, for example in the clinic or with microscopes, to be good enough for future readers to reinterpret for themselves. The whole point of a proper research record is that the future can re-evaluate the past in light of what by then will be newly known. Degradation of the research record obviates much of the purpose of the work having been done in the first place and undoes the effort of previous generations. It is worse than wasteful. The Dean saw my objections as irrational and reactionary. He articulated his judgment. "You're just an unreconstructed, old-fashioned academic, Hans." I took his rebuke as a compliment. I am glad to be identified as an unreconstructed, old-fashioned academic. We great army of old-fashioned academics have played our part in building civilization, and I say, you're welcome. In any case, my objections fell on deaf ears and the dental library was disbanded, as were in fact collections from across the entirety of the university, in a great act of rationalisation that I maintain was actually vandalism. The books are gone, the journals are gone, the theses are gone, and all are irreplaceable. The chain is not only broken, in places it is lost altogether. I don't know if I can fully express my outrage that I was right in my predictions on the dismal quality of scanned thesis images, looking at the now available digital record of just my own PhD thesis and those of my research students. Carefully prepared photomicrographs, electron micrographs and other key images are entirely unreadable, whereas the originals were beautiful photographs prepared with enormous darkroom effort. The digital scans are coarse, unrecognisable black and white photocopy-type pictures that could never be reinterpreted by any future reader. The accumulated century and a half of research student effort, adding to knowledge and cutting new intellectual ground, has been destroyed with a disrespect for which I have nothing but derision. The university's libraries do still house some books and journals, but the collection is greatly diminished and impoverished. Instead, there are banks of computers through which library users can access online journal articles and, of course, the poor quality scans of the university's own older theses. But who would bother to look at those given their degraded state? I do admit it is enormously convenient to access the literature via computer, and it is especially convenient now that I depend on satellite connection to access the library whilst on the road. But that does not obviate responsibility of libraries to store knowledge in a secure way. Hardbound copies of journals, all now pulped, had the benefit of physical presence independent of the commercial vagaries inherent to online providers. Not many business ventures survive across multiple generations, and yet our libraries have made themselves entirely dependent on commercial online entities for access to the great bulk of even the old literature that they threw out. All it takes to completely erase the digital record of human achievement is a few misplaced electromagnetic pulses. At least when each library had its own collection of bound volumes, the scientific record would survive a few library fires. The current configuration seems to me far more vulnerable, and it is naive to believe the bland assurances that the precious store of world knowledge is safe somewhere up there in the cloud. Think of the billions spent on research, and then think of the billions wasted if the publications recording that research are lost. Now consider whether it is more sensible for each university to keep physical copies of journals, even if only in optical disc form, rather than to rely on annual subscriptions to commercial enterprises that may or may not exist in the near or distant future, or that are vulnerable to any of many forms of electronic misadventure. From what I have written, you might imagine this to be a very recent phenomenon, but I think it started in little steps many years ago, even before the internet made online journals possible. It will have been around 1991 when I was postdocing in Melbourne. I had an idea about the rapid binding of white blood cells to blood vessels in the first moments of an injury. The process is so remarkably fast that I thought enzyme activation might be important. That particular idea was eventually proven wrong, but was nonetheless at the time worth thinking about. I knew from my undergraduate studies the remarkable speed of binding, but could not find a reference to the original work that had demonstrated it, and so called my old mentor in Sydney, John Gibbons, to ask where the publication might be found. He advised me to look in Howard Florey's textbook on pathology. Florey was an Australian experimental pathologist who did much remarkable research and gifted the world penicillin together with his colleague Ernst Chain, and based on earlier observations by Alexander Fleming. They all shared the Nobel Prize for their shared contribution, but I hadn't known Florey had further gifted the world a most wonderful pathology textbook. If you read any good current textbook on pathology, you will get an excellent summary of current understanding. But should you look at Florey's textbook on pathology, you will get something much more. In addition to a description of the then current understanding, Florey also showed the actual graphs, microscope photographs and other experimental images from the original research publications underpinning the knowledge conveyed. To read Florey's textbook is to learn not just what we know, but also how we know it. The man was a scientific giant, and it is fitting that Florey's face appeared on Australia's original $50 note. Given that so many Australians and others across the globe owe their lives to him, I can't imagine why his image was later replaced when the new currency was released. In any case, on John's recommendation, I went looking for Florey's textbook, but was surprised it could not be found in either of the two medical libraries ready to hand at Royal Melbourne Hospital or at the University of Melbourne. Not to worry, I thought, the Florey Institute, right next door, will have a copy. But nope, they didn't have Florey's textbook either, and the Florey Institute librarian was surprised to learn from me that any such book existed. I didn't hold much hope, but then went to the Melbourne University Dental Library. In those days, books were found by flicking through card files, but I found no card for Florey's text. Wondering where I could look next, and walking out of the library, I noticed an untidy pile of books on the librarian's desk. Glancing across, the word Florey stood out on one of the spines. Looking closer, there it was. Florey, General Pathology. Grabbing the book, I went to the librarian to let him know the card was missing and to loan the book. He asked where I'd got it from, and I pointed to the tottering stack from which it had been plucked. He said, "Oh no, those books aren't for loan. We're throwing them out. Nobody's taken any of them out for years." I was taken aback. Throwing it out? Do you know who the author is? I drew a $50 note from my wallet, pointed to the picture, and explained the book had been written by one of the nation's greatest scientists. I also told him how this appeared to be the only copy of Florey's textbook in Melbourne University, and perhaps for all I knew, the only copy anywhere in Melbourne. I concluded, This is a rare book by an important Australian. You can't throw it out." Pausing slightly as the librarian considered my comments, I asked, "Can I have it?" Uncertain of the official policy on valuable books bound for the bin, he replied, "No. Now that I know, I think I'll just keep it here." That was 35 years prior to this writing, and I rather suspect Florey's textbook will now be gone, because, as the librarian said, no one will have loaned it for years, and our libraries have meanwhile been emptied out. Once the last copy of Florey's great book is forgotten, and should full access to the digital literature collapse, as seems quite likely long-term, I wonder if anyone will ever be able to piece together the story of how we came to understand fundamentals of disease processes, and possibly anything else of complexity. I do worry about that, but I am even more worried that just now the current record of current scientific accomplishments is degrading, so that what we leave for the future is becoming ever more sketchy and in places downright and knowingly wrong, that can only produce sketchy and wrong-headed long-term outcomes, which is a terrible legacy to leave. Paper mills, self-promotion and AI bullshit. Some months ago, I received an unexpected message via LinkedIn, a professional social media platform. For a fee, I was offered supposed data and the services of a professional team who would prepare and submit on my behalf a paper to leading journals, payment only required once the paper is accepted. No actual work would be required of me other than to send money at the appropriate time. It was a totally dishonest proposition that I rejected out of hand, making it clear I wished to hear no more from him or from anyone associated with him. That the data will likely have been as false as the proposition itself seems to me self-evident. The literature is increasingly blighted with what seems a flood of fake papers with fake data from fake investigators. There are ever more prevalent reports about plagiarised data and text, figures that demonstrate mathematical or scientific nonsense, and all manner of other academic misconduct. With rare exceptions in time and place, academia has long had a publish or perish culture, so that it has become quite some achievement to survive to academic seniority. But in recent years, the combined effects of ever-tightening research grants, the imposition of excessive publication fees, sometimes irrational wokeness, institutional and departmental mergers, and the insidious effect of creeping managerialism have turned universities from places of discovery, teaching and quiet contemplation to blood-sport-spattered academic arenas where collegiality is abused in desperate competition to survive. I will write quite a bit more on this separately, but just for the moment, please do accept that universities have become perverted from their prime purpose and are now pretty terrible places to work. Not unlike the exponential growth in COVID cases we saw during the recent pandemic, has been exponential growth in the number of academic publications, accelerated by increasing use of artificial intelligence, AI, to write and review manuscripts. Authors are pumping out AI-written papers for AI editors to scan before sending to AI reviewers to evaluate for publication in online journals read by AI for purposes of writing more AI-based papers. Human intelligence seems no longer involved other than for purposes of getting oneself listed as an author or reviewer, both being helpful and necessary metrics required to outlive the next round of academic staff cuts. What has become of greatest value has been to construct a readily comprehensible and compelling narrative. Grants are written and awarded increasingly on basis of how well their story is told. Scientific ideas are propelled well when they fit within the narrative of the day, and professional success requires to skillfully build a story confirmed not by empirical facts, but by carefully cultivated relationships and social media accounts. The truth, whether simple or inherently complex, is no longer good enough to guarantee award of research grants, publications, or career advancement. The narrative is all, and whether it is truthful or not no longer counts for much. Just at the moment, the news is full of the sad story of the youngest ever black Cambridge professor having committed suicide after discovery and widespread public discussion of him having most likely plagiarised his PhD thesis, and of him having stretched the truth about some totally irrelevant sporting activity. A separate scientific colleague of mine was astonished to discover his PhD thesis had been copied near line by another academic for his PhD, and that the plagiarist went on to build a highly successful career falsifying data. When my colleague notified the relevant academic institution of the plagiarism and falsifications, they defended the offender and covered it up, presumably to prevent bad press and keep the research grants. My own expulsion from my own university followed my having reported separate instances of falsification of academic record by senior academic appointees. The academic enterprise has become rotten, and with that the now burgeoning academic record is being made rotten as well. Sorting the sound from the soiled becomes an ever more mammoth task, and increasingly one must ask, who will be left to do it? Narrative nonsense. We live in an era of perpetual entertainment. From the mid-20th century onwards, we have welcomed sequential and increasingly intrusive entertainments into our homes and lives. For decades, we have more and more bombarded our senses with radio, television, vinyl records, compact discs, computer games, smartphones, YouTube, and social media of many different forms. An unhealthy obsession with our mobile phones consumes our focus with almost anything but talking with one another, while near panic sets in if the phone is lost or goes dead. We have become entertainment junkies, hanging out for the next quick dopamine hit, and that doesn't seem terribly healthy. What's more is that much of what we consume is obviously and ever more clearly rubbish. Now, I'm not suggesting there's any special vice in enjoying the nonsense. I take as much pleasure as anyone in escapist silliness, and am annoyed by po-faced, serious-minded killjoys who disdain anything but the most meaningful of cultural experiences. However, just quietly, here in private, just between you and me, we do have to admit that much of what we soak up as entertainment is pretty stupid. The stream of high-quality pap that pours through movie houses and televisions rarely stands the slightest critical appraisal, not on style or production, which are near uniformly outstanding, but on content and sense. The premises upon which they are built are often so flimsy or so embedded in superstition or paranoia or odd political or social bias that they can't be taken seriously. The imaginative world is now populated with superheroes, supervillains, and ordinary people with superpowers doing super strange things. It's all a bit superficial. Magic, monsters, ghosts and demons interspersed with paranoid portrayals of secret societies and corrupt governments, soaked in evil intent, all overseen by the aliens amongst us and committed to enslavement of humanity once the zombie, viral, nuclear, climate, military, meteorite, global toxin apocalypse is done. Boys meet girls, meet persons of indefinite pronouns in highly unlikely circumstances and combinations in an ever-spinning, heart-warming rotunda of hallmark nonsense. Theatres are full of the formulaic, predictable and satisfyingly easy to watch, which is, I suppose, why we all watch them. There are, of course, outstanding and brilliant exceptions, but not so many as to change an overall assessment that the storytelling media have become more stupefying than anything else. Computer games are often bizarre and or violent, and I guess that's part of their appeal, but I've been surprised by advertisements in my feed to participate in patently infantile games for mobile phones, I find it troubling that adults and children alike waste obsessed conscious hours in these strangely limited electronic fantasies, sometimes blurring the border between the real and the imagined with augmented reality. An Orwellian term, if ever there was one. Professor Brian Cook was a remarkable academic and oral pathologist who established the medical and dental schools in Cardiff, and although in retirement was invited in the mid-1980s to evaluate the Sydney Dental School for need of an oral pathology department. I was a PhD student at the time and got to know him a little, but neither of us could have known how his recommendation would one day establish the position for which I would serve much of my later career. Brian was an astute person and judged television to be chewing gum for the eyes. I can only guess at what he would think of the further electronic guff we daily digest, but I'm pretty sure it would not be in the least bit flattering for us all. Attention spans have measurably shortened in successive years. The entertainment bombardment seems to be turning our brains to mush. Even written narrative seems to be degraded. I must have been somewhere between 9 and 11 years of age when I devoured the Billabong series by Mary Grant Bruce, loaned volume by volume from the Waverley Public Library. They had been written in the earlier decades of the 1900s about the fictional Billabong station and described the lives of the children and other characters who populated the stories. I was recently in a second-hand bookshop in West Australia's Perth and chanced across Nora of Billabong high on a shelf. Out of nostalgia, I leafed through and read the first few pages. The scene described was of Nora, the squatter's daughter, at the start of celebrations for her last day of boarding school. She and the other graduating girls were in their finest, while to her delight her brother and his friend Wally had come as well. The pages were well crafted with some light humour referencing the inner emotional worlds of the students, visitors and teachers described. By comparison with more recently written books, the high level of sophistication and subtlety in language and content of the first few pages of the Billabong text was striking. Bear in mind that the Billabong books were written for children and that they compare favourably with more recently published books written not only for children but also for adults. I do invite you to go look for Mary Grant Bruce's work and make the comparison for yourself. It's an eye-opener. As if to confirm substance to my surprise, Unseen Algorithms assigned to me just yesterday a YouTube video in which an articulate young woman describes, explains and laments profound diminution in literacy amongst Americans over a period of decades. She traces blame to abandonment of phonetics in schools, and she makes a good case, although there may well be more at work. Whether well told or poorly understood, stories are how we communicate with each other and across the ages. But if we do have something to say, whether about ourselves or on some matter of fact or academic or operational interest, or in fiction, or perhaps of some deep psychological or emotional aspect of the human condition, it should at the very least be the truth as we see it. H.G. Wells and the 1960 movie made from his Time Machine book have given good warning. It is up to us to heed it and make sure the ugly fantasy painted in that art does not become an ugly truth we thrust upon our descendants. If you have found this essay interesting or entertaining, please do share it with someone you think would appreciate it and encourage them to subscribe. Thanks for your attention.